The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of Riverside Diner, casting long shadows across the checkered floor where Nina Torres moved with practiced grace between the crowded tables. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her white apron bore the stains of another busy breakfast rush. At 24, she had worked at this small diner on the outskirts of the city for 3 years, serving coffee and comfort food to truckers, construction workers, and the occasional lost traveler. Nina had learned to navigate the world with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. The jagged scar that ran from her left wrist to her elbow was a constant reminder of a past she couldn't remember, a mark that drew stares and whispered questions from customers who thought she couldn't hear. She had grown skilled at deflecting their curiosity with humor and quick wit, but each comment still stung like salt in an old wound. The diner bell chimed as another customer entered, and Nina glanced up from wiping down a table to see a man in an expensive charcoal suit surveying the modest establishment. He looked completely out of place among the worn vinyl booths and faded photographs of the city's industrial past. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his sharp blue eyes seemed to take in every detail of the room with an intensity that made Nina uncomfortable. Julian Pierce had built his technology empire from nothing, turning a small software company into a billion-dollar corporation that revolutionized how people connected across the globe. He was known for his brilliant mind and ruthless business tactics. But those who knew him well understood that beneath his success lay a deep well of pain. 18 years ago, his younger sister Alina had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions in a family shattered by guilt and grief. The man chose a corner booth, and Nina approached with her usual professional smile, notepad in hand. "Good morning, what can I get started for you today?" Julian looked up, and for a moment time seemed to stop. The waitress before him had the same green eyes as his sister, the same delicate bone structure that he remembered from countless childhood photographs, but it was something else that made his breath catch in his throat. A small birthmark just visible beneath the edge of her sleeve, shaped like a crescent moon. It was identical to the one Alina had carried, the one their mother used to call her lucky charm. "Just coffee, Black," he managed to say, his voice rougher than intended. Nina nodded and moved to pour his coffee, unaware of the storm of emotion she had unleashed in the stranger. As she set the cup down, Julian noticed how her hands trembled slightly, and he caught a glimpse of the scar that disappeared beneath her uniform sleeve. "That's quite a scar," Julian said softly, immediately regretting the words as he saw her stiffen. Nina's smile became more forced, a protective barrier she had perfected over the years. "Car accident when I was little. Don't remember much about it. Honestly, memory's funny that way sometimes." The words hit Julian like a physical blow. 18 years ago, Alina had been in a car accident with their nanny. The woman had died on impact, but Elena's body was never found. The police had assumed she had been thrown from the vehicle and swept away by the rushing river below. But Julian had never stopped hoping that somehow, impossibly, his sister had survived. "Do you remember anything from before the accident?" Julian pressed, trying to keep his voice casual despite the rapid beating of his heart. Nina's expression grew guarded. She had learned to be wary of strangers who asked too many questions about her past. "Not really. I grew up in the state system after that. Look, is there anything else you need?" "We're pretty busy today." Julian wanted to tell her everything, to explain who he thought she might be, but he could see the walls going up around her. Instead, he simply nodded and watched as she moved away to serve other customers. He spent the next hour nursing his coffee and observing Nina as she worked, noting the way she moved with unconscious grace, how she tilted her head when she laughed, and the gentle way she spoke to an elderly man who seemed lonely. When Nina finally had a moment to breathe, she found Julian still sitting in his booth, staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was something familiar about him that she couldn't place, a feeling that made her both curious and uneasy. "You're still here," she said, refilling his coffee cup without being asked. "I own a company not far from here," Julian lied smoothly. "Sometimes I like to get away from the office, find somewhere quiet to think." Nina glanced around the noisy diner with its clattering dishes and boisterous conversations. quiet isn't exactly what we're known for. Julian smiled, the first genuine expression she had seen from him. Sometimes the best kind of quiet is found in the middle of chaos. There was something profound in his words that resonated with Nina. She had always felt most at peace when she was working, when her hands were busy and her mind could drift. The constant motion and noise of the diner had become her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in routine and forget about the questions that haunted her quiet moments. "I know what you mean," she said, surprising herself with the admission. "This place saved me in a lot of ways." Julian studied her face, seeing glimpses of the little girl he had lost so many years ago. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Their conversation was interrupted by the dinner bell and a rush of lunch customers. Nina hurried away to take orders and serve food, but she found herself glancing back at the mysterious man in the expensive suit who seemed to understand. Something about her that she didn't even understand herself. As the afternoon wore on, Julian made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He pulled out his phone and called his private investigator, a man who had been searching for Alina for years without success. "I need you to run a background check on someone," Julian said quietly into the phone. "Nina Torres, works at Riverside, diner on Industrial Boulevard. I need everything you can find, especially anything about her childhood or the accident that gave her that scar." When Nina's shift finally ended, she was exhausted but oddly energized by her encounter with the stranger. There had been something in his eyes when he looked at her, a recognition that both thrilled and terrified her. She had spent her entire adult life avoiding questions about her past, but for the first time, she found herself wanting answers. Julian waited until she left the diner before following at a distance. He watched as she walked to a small apartment building in a rundown part of town, noting how she stopped to help an elderly woman with her groceries and paused to pet a stray cat. Everything about her reminded him of Alina, the sister who had always been kind to everyone, who had collected herd animals and given her allowance to homeless people. That night, Julian sat in his penthouse office overlooking the city, staring at a photograph of Alina taken just days before the accident. She had been 6 years old, gap-toothed, and grinning. Wearing a yellow dress with the crescent moon birthmark clearly visible on her arm, the resemblance to Nina was undeniable. But Julian had learned not to trust hope. He had followed too many false leads over the years, each one ending in disappointment and renewed grief. But something about Nina felt different. It wasn't just her physical resemblance to Alina, or even the birthmark. It was the way she moved through the world with quiet strength, the way she had survived whatever had happened to her and built a life from nothing. It was exactly what he would have expected from his sister, the girl who had been brave enough to chase lightning bugs and thunderstorms and smart enough to beat him at chess when she was only 5 years old. Julian made another call, this time to Dr. Victoria Lane, a geneticist who specialized in family reunification cases. If Nina was truly Alina, DNA testing would provide the definitive answer. But first he would need to convince her to take the test, and he suspected that wouldn't be easy. Nina Torres had clearly learned to protect herself from a world that had hurt her before, and breaking through those defenses would require patience, compassion, perhaps a little bit of the same stubborn determination that had built his empire from nothing. The next morning, Julian returned to Riverside Diner with a plan and a heart full of hope that he was afraid to fully acknowledge. One way or another, he was going to discover the truth about Nina Torres, even if it shattered the carefully constructed life she had built for herself. Because if there was even a chance that she was Alina, he couldn't walk away. He had lost his sister once, and he wasn't going to lose her again. Julian returned to Riverside Diner the next morning, this time carrying a leather portfolio that contained the preliminary background report his investigator had compiled overnight. The information was sparse but compelling. Nina Torres had appeared in the foster care system 18 years ago with no memory of her life before the accident. She had been found by hikers near the same river where Alina had disappeared. Suffering from severe injuries and complete amnesia, Nina looked up as the bell chimed, and she felt that same strange flutter in her chest when she saw the well-dressed man from yesterday. He seemed different today, more purposeful, and there was an intensity in his gaze that made her nervous. "Back for more of our world-famous coffee?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light as she approached his table. Actually, I was hoping we could talk, Julian said, gesturing to the seat across from him. Please, just for a few minutes. Nina glanced around the diner, noting that the morning rush hadn't started yet, and her manager was busy in the kitchen. Against her better judgment, she slid into the booth across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. My name is Julian Pierce, he began, watching her face carefully for any sign of recognition. When she showed none, he continued. I think you might be someone very important to me. Nina's eyebrows rose skeptically. Look, if this is some kind of weird pickup line, I should tell you I'm really not interested in whatever you're selling. Julian couldn't help but smile at her directness. It was exactly something Elena would have said. Even as a child, she had been fearless in speaking her mind. It's not a pickup line, Nina. I think you might be my sister. The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Nina stared at him, waiting for the punchline or the reveal that this was some elaborate joke. When neither came, she felt something cold settle in her stomach. That's impossible, she said quietly. I don't have any family.
Ow.
I grew up in foster care. Julian leaned forward, his voice gentle but urgent. 18 years ago, my 6-year-old sister Elena disappeared in a car accident. She was with our nanny when their car went off a bridge during a storm. The nanny died, but Elena's body was never found. He paused, studying Nina's pale face. You have a birthmark on your arm, shaped like a crescent moon? Elena had the exact same mark. Nina's hand instinctively moved to cover her arm, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. Lots of people have birthmarks. That doesn't mean anything. You're right, Julian agreed. But combined with your age, the timing of when you entered the system, the location where you were found, and the fact that you look exactly like Elena, would have looked at your age, ... He pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph of a little girl with green eyes and dark hair, grinning at the camera. This was taken a week before she disappeared. Nina stared at the photograph, feeling as though the ground was shifting beneath her feet. The little girl in the picture could have been her at that age. The resemblance was undeniable, but accepting. What Julian was suggesting felt like stepping off a cliff into an unknown abyss. Why are you doing this? She whispered, her voice barely audible above the clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Because I've been looking for her for 18 years, Julian said simply. Because not a day goes by that I don't think about her. Because if there's even a chance that you're Elena, I need to know. Nina felt tears threatening, and she blinked them back angrily. She had learned long ago that crying solved nothing, that the only person she could depend on was herself. And if you're wrong, and I'm just some random waitress who happens to look like your sister, then I'll apologize for disrupting your life and walk away, Julian promised. But Nina, what if I'm right? Don't you want to know who you really are? The question hit Nina like a physical blow because it touched on her deepest, most carefully hidden longing. She had spent years telling herself that the past didn't matter, that she was fine on her own, but the truth was that she dreamed constantly about a life before the accident. Sometimes she woke with fragments of memories that felt more real than dreams. Images of a big house with a garden, of someone singing lullabies in a voice she couldn't quite place. What would you need from me? She asked, her voice barely steady. DNA test, Julian said. Simple, just a cheek swab. Dr. Victoria Lane is a geneticist who specializes in these kinds of cases. She could have results in 48 hours. Nina was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photograph on Julian's phone. The little girl looked so happy, so loved, and Nina found herself wondering what it would feel like to have that kind of security, that certainty of belonging somewhere. If I do this, she said finally, and the test says, I'm not your sister, you leave me alone. No more visits, no more questions. I go back to my life, and you go back to yours. Julian nodded, though the thought of walking away from her felt impossible. I give you my word. Dr. Victoria Lane's laboratory was located in a sleek medical building downtown, a world away from the modest diner where Nina spent her days. As they rode the elevator to the 15th floor, Nina felt increasingly out of place in her simple jeans and sweater next to Julian's expensive suit. Dr. Lane was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She explained the testing process with professional warmth, making Nina feel more at ease, despite the magnitude of what they were doing. The test itself is very simple, Dr. Lane assured her as she prepared the collection kit. Just a quick swab of the inside of your cheek, and then we compare your DNA to Mr. Pierce's to look for familial markers. Nina submitted to the test with outward calm, but inside her mind was racing. Part of her hoped desperately that Julian was right, that she truly belonged to someone, that the aching loneliness she had carried her entire life might finally have an explanation. But another part of her was terrified of the possibility, afraid of what it might mean to discover that she had a family who had been searching for her all these years. Results will be ready by Thursday, Dr. Lane said as they prepared to leave. I'll call as soon as I have them. The next 2 days passed in a blur of nervous energy and restless nights. Nina found herself studying her reflection in mirrors, looking for resemblances to Julian that she might have missed. She caught herself daydreaming about what it would be like to have a brother, someone who shared her history and could help fill in the blank spaces of her memory. Julian, meanwhile, was consumed with preparations for the possibility that Nina truly was Alina. He had his assistant clear his schedule and spent hours going through old family photographs and videos, gathering evidence of the life his sister had lived before the accident. He called his father, Robert Pierce, who lived in seclusion on the family estate, still haunted by the tragedy that had torn their family apart. I think I might have found her, Dad, Julian said into the phone, his voice shaking with emotion. I think Alina might be alive. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Julian wondered if the call had been dropped. When his father finally spoke, his voice was rough with tears. Don't do this to me, Julian. I can't survive. Another false hope. This is different, Julian insisted. She looks exactly like Mom did at that age, and she has Elena's birthmark. We're running DNA tests. Robert Pierce had never recovered from the night his daughter disappeared. He blamed himself for the argument that had sent his wife Grace out into the storm with Elena, the fight that had ultimately led to Grace's death and Elena's disappearance. For 18 years, he had lived as a broken man, unable to forgive himself for the words that could never be taken back. Thursday morning arrived with a gray sky that matched Nina's mood. She had barely slept, and her hands shook as she poured coffee for the early morning customers. When her phone rang at 10:30, she nearly dropped the pot. Nina, this is Dr. Lane. Could you come in this afternoon? I have your results. The doctor's voice gave nothing away, but Nina felt her world tilt on its axis. Is Julian coming too? He's already here. We've been waiting for you. Nina's manager let her leave early, sensing that something important was happening, though she didn't ask questions. The drive to Dr. Lane's office felt like the longest journey of Nina's life, each mile bringing her closer to an answer that would change everything. Julian was pacing in the waiting room when she arrived, his usual composure completely shattered. He looked up when she entered, and she saw her own fear and hope reflected in his eyes. Dr. Lane led them into her office and gestured for them to sit. Nina's heart was beating so hard she felt dizzy, and she gripped the arms of her chair to steady herself. I've reviewed the results multiple times to be absolutely certain, Dr. Lane began, her professional mask not quite hiding her own excitement. Nina, the DNA analysis confirms with 99.9% certainty that you and Julian are siblings. The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the room. Nina felt as though she was falling, as though the carefully constructed foundation of her life had just crumbled beneath her feet. Julian made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and she turned to look at him through her own tears. Alina, he whispered, and the name felt like coming home. The Pierce family estate sat on 50 acres of rolling hills outside the city, its stone facade weathered by decades of storms and secrets. As Julian's car wound up the long driveway, Nina pressed her face to the window.
Studying the imposing structure that had apparently been her childhood home.
Fragments of memory flickered at the edges of her consciousness, like photographs glimpsed in peripheral vision. Do you remember anything? Julian asked softly, watching her face for signs of recognition. Nina shook her head, frustrated by the blankness where her early memories should be. Sometimes I think I do, but then it's gone. It's like trying to hold on to a dream after you wake up. The front door opened before they reached it, and a man emerged who looked like an older version of Julian. Robert Pierce had aged dramatically in the 18 years since Elena's disappearance. His hair completely gray and his face marked by lines of grief. When he saw Nina, he stopped short, his hand gripping the doorframe for support. "My God," he breathed. "Grace, you look exactly like your mother." The name hit Nina like a physical blow, and suddenly she was 6 years old again, standing in a garden full of roses while a woman with gentle hands braided flowers into her hair. The memory came flooding back with such intensity that she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "Mama used to make flower crowns," she whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep inside her. She sang while she worked in the garden. Robert Pierce began to cry then, 18 years of suppressed grief pouring out as he looked at the daughter he thought he had lost forever. "She loved those roses," he said through his tears. "She planted them the year you were born." The next. A few hours passed in a strange dreamlike state as Nina wandered through the house that had been her first home. Julian and Robert followed at a distance, giving her space to process but ready to catch her if she fell. In the library, she ran her fingers along the spines of children's books that felt familiar. In the kitchen, she knew without looking where, the cookie jar was kept. And in what had been her childhood bedroom, now preserved exactly as she had left it, she found a stuffed elephant named Peanuts that triggered a cascade of memories. "I remember falling down the stairs," she said suddenly, sitting on the small bed with the elephant clutched to her chest. "I was trying to bring Peanuts to Mama because she was crying." Julian and Robert exchanged glances. The night Elena disappeared, Grace had been crying because of the terrible fight she and Robert had just finished. Elena had indeed fallen down the stairs trying to comfort her mother, though neither man had realized she remembered. "That was the night of the accident," Robert said quietly. "Your mother was taking you to stay with your grandmother for a few days while we worked things?" Out. I was so angry, so stupid and jealous. I said things I can never take back. Nina looked at her father, this broken man who had spent nearly 2 decades drowning in guilt, and felt something shift inside her chest. The anger she had expected to feel wasn't there. Instead, she felt a deep sadness for all the years they had lost, all the love that had been interrupted by tragedy and misunderstanding. "What were you fighting about?" she asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. Robert sat heavily in the small chair that had once been used for bedtime stories. "I thought your mother was having an affair. I was working all the time, building the business, and I convinced myself that she had found someone else. I was wrong about everything, but by the time I realized it, it was too late." "She loved you," Nina said, with sudden certainty, another memory surfacing. "She used to wait by the window when you were late coming home. We would make your favorite dinner and pretend she wasn't worried." The simple statement broke Robert completely. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Nina slipped off the bed and went to him, this stranger who was her father. Put her arms around him, the way she would comfort any broken soul. "I'm sorry," Robert whispered against her shoulder. "I'm so sorry for everything, for the fight, for losing you, for not being there when you needed me." "I'm here now," Nina said simply, and she realized as she spoke the words that she meant them. Despite everything that had happened, despite the years of loneliness and uncertainty, she was home. The integration into the Pierce family wasn't easy. Nina continued working at the diner despite Julian's offers to support her financially, needing the familiar routine to anchor her as she navigated this new reality. She moved into a guest room at the estate, but kept her small apartment unwilling to give up the independence she had fought so hard to achieve. There were difficult moments when the weight of recovered memories became overwhelming. She remembered her mother's funeral, which she had been too injured to attend, and the confusion of waking up in a hospital with no memory of who she was. She recalled the early years in foster care, the well-meaning families who tried to love. Her butt couldn't fill the hole left by her lost identity, but there were beautiful moments too. Julian taught her to play chess again, patiently helping her remember strategies their mother had shown her as a child. Robert took her to visit Grace's grave, where Nina finally got to say goodbye to the woman who had sung her lullabies and made flower crowns. And slowly, carefully, they began to build something new from the pieces of what had been broken. One evening, as autumn painted the estate's trees in brilliant colors, Nina found herself in the rose garden where her mother had spent so many happy hours. The roses were dormant now, preparing for winter's sleep. But Nina could still smell their phantom fragrance in the crisp air. Julian found her there, sitting on the stone bench where Grace used to read stories on summer afternoons. "Penny for your thoughts?" he said, settling beside her. "I keep thinking about all the time we lost," Nina admitted. "All the birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments that we can never get back." Julian nodded, understanding the grief that came with their miraculous reunion. "We have now," he said. "We have whatever time we're given from this point forward." Nina leaned against her brother's shoulder, marveling at how natural the gesture felt, despite their years apart. "Do you think Mama would be happy that we found each other again?" "I think she would be proud of the woman you became," Julian said. "You survived something that would have broken most people, and you did it with grace and kindness and tact. That's exactly who she raised you to be in those first 6 years." As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Nina thought about the children at the orphanage where she still volunteered. Kids like Tommy, who was 8 years old and angry at the world for taking his parents away. She had always felt a special connection to the lost ones. The children who carried scars, both visible and hidden. Now she understood why. "I want to do something," she said suddenly. "With the family foundation, I want to help kids who are aging out of the system, kids who need someone to believe in them." Julian smiled, recognizing the spark of purpose in his sister's eyes that reminded him so much of their mother. "Dad will love that idea. He's been looking for ways to honor Mom's memory." The Pierce Foundation for Lost Children was established. 6 months later, with Nina as its director and a mission to provide support, education, and love to young people transitioning out of foster care. The foundation's first scholarship recipient was Tommy, the angry 8-year-old who had slowly learned to trust again under Nina's patient guidance. On the first anniversary of their reunion, the Pierce family gathered in the Rose Garden for a celebration that was both joyful and bittersweet. Robert had commissioned a memorial stone for Grace, inscribed with her favorite quote about love being the bridge between two hearts. Nina placed a crown of roses on the stone, remembering the woman who had given her the foundation of love that sustained her through the darkest years. "I used to dream about having a family," Nina said, as they stood together in the fading light. "But I never imagined it could be like this. I thought, if I ever found you, it would be like going back to being that 6-year-old girl. Instead, I feel like I'm becoming someone new, someone who belongs to both the person I was and the person I became." Julian put his arm around his sister, his heart full of gratitude for the second chance they had been given. "Mom used to say that love doesn't erase the past. It transforms it into something beautiful. I think she was right." As night fell over the estate, Nina Elena Pierce looked up at the stars and felt the completeness she had searched for her entire life. She was no longer just the waitress with a scar or the lost girl from the foster system. She was a daughter, a sister, a survivor, who had found her way home. And in the morning, she would return to the diner one last time to give her notice, ready to begin the next chapter of a story that had always been leading her back to where she belonged. The roses would bloom again in spring, and Nina would be there to tend them, carrying forward her mother's legacy of love while building something entirely her own. She had learned that sometimes the greatest gift isn't finding what you've lost, but discovering that you were never really lost at all. You were simply becoming who you were always meant to be.